for us been on the journey for so long to see so many people come out for an all-day thing. So thank you very much. What I'm going to show you today, I used to give FORC training things when I visited people's labs, and it would take probably half a day. And so I've compressed half a day into, I hope, 45 minutes. So there's only one major logic leap. I've been told that there'll be a lot of people in the room who've never used FORCs. And so that's the audience to whom I've pitched this. So it'll be boring for people like Ramon and Dave and others. But that's the audience I've been told to try and hit. So now my computer is frozen. That's why. Oh, great. Okay. So this work, I often don't talk about the backstory because, you know, you get a limited time period to speak at meetings. I've been fortunate through my career to have over 30 postdocs. Chris was the first. And they've all been incredibly talented people. Chris, this was in 2019. Most of you, I guess, have not met Chris. So to talk about him a little bit is probably interesting. He's an incredibly careful experimentalist. And a lot of what we do today goes right back to what he did at the origins. And he knew the problems and always aimed for better, more precise measurements to reduce noise, to get a better experimental setup. And Ramon's going to talk about that this afternoon. It's incredibly important to getting good FORC measurements. I was a postdoc at UC Davis with Ken Veresub at the time, and Chris was a physics PhD student. He's older than me by about 4 years. And I would go down to the basement to measure hysteresis loops on an old Princeton Applied Research VSM, great instrument. And Chris was there doing stuff and singing. And we got talking, and he was doing his PhD on Projectile Theory. And he thought it was a complete intellectual ghetto, his words, not mine. And, you know, all the debate at the beginning about is FORC equal to Project, is Project equal to FORC, I find completely sterile and boring. Hopefully we've moved past that. But it led to these papers, which I think most of you know. And the first paper in 1999 was it was in a physics journal aimed at a physics audience, which set up the approach experimentally, leaning on Pryzak and Nayal, of course. And then the paper that I led in 2000, which was really aimed at a geological audience, people like us measuring geological materials. And the first paragraph really sets up the motivation that most dirty samples that we measure are so complicated that you want to be able to pick out the components. And there's been a huge amount of work done by lots of people in the room to pick out magnetic components. So that was really the motivation when Chris and I started talking about this scarily 30 years ago. So why FORC diagrams? This is an image that I like to show. We put it in our 2014 review paper, and most of what I'll show you today is from that. It's from a paper that Chris did. But if you look at the hysteresis loops, the major hysteresis loops for these samples, you can see that there are differences, but they're very similar, yeah? Yet, if you calculate a FORC distribution for each of them, they're vastly different. And these differences tell you about fundamentals in the magnetization process. These are all material science materials, which particularly the left-hand and the right-hand one, you won't see in nature, but it is what it is. So FORCs are really useful also in fundamental physics applications, as well as trying to untangle our dirty samples. So down to basics. What is a FORC, a first order reversal curve? Well, if you start at positive saturation, ramp the field down to a field known as the reversal field, you measure a magnetization curve back up to positive saturation, and the measurement points on this reversal curve, the magnetization is a function of the reversal field and at that measurement field, yeah? Straightforward. And so then you measure this curve all the way back up to positive saturation. and you'll measure a series of reversal curves like so, and that's your set of measurements. So then the FORC data are transformed into a FORC diagram by calculating this mixed second derivative. And essentially what you're doing is calculating the curvature of that, which is telling you about the magnetization switching events as you go through these curves that really give you information about what's going on in the middle of the hysteresis loop. And so it's a function of, it's a mixed second derivative because it involves the reversal curve and the measurement field. And then if you like doing this when you look at diagrams, then you're perfectly happy with this sort of presentation. But we do a coordinate transformation to flip it 90 degrees to make it more visually easy to look at. There are people who prefer to look at the original version. I tend not to be one of those people. And so if you plot the reversal field versus the measurement field, you start at saturation and you measure your first reversal curve, then your second, and there's increasing numbers of data points as you go. And you'll notice it looks a bit blurry on the left-hand side. This was one of the things that Chris noticed very early, that when you're sweeping a magnet from positive saturation to a reversal field, the magnet goes very quickly and gives you an imprecise field measurement. And so you have to set the field again to get it to give you the field you want. And so various people, Ramon, Richard Harris and others in their code will have a first point artifact removal because of this. And Chris saw this right at the beginning. And you know, magnet control is a complicated thing, but that's what that's about. So if you plot the FORC distribution on the measurement grid, that's what it looks like. If you want to rotate it, then you change from this coordinate system of reversal curve and reversal point and measurement field to, I've labeled the vertical as BI. I is not the ideal indicator to use before someone tells me that, thank you. And so if you want to go to BI, BC coordinates, that's what you do. It's a very simple arithmetic transformation. Okay, and so then what is the meaning of the vertical and horizontal axes on a FORC diagram? This goes back to Pryzak and Niel theory. What I'm going to give you is a super simple explanation. When I started explaining this years ago, someone said I didn't understand that. So if the equation I show you and the addition of numbers seems insulting, I want to make sure everybody gets it. Yeah. So if you imagine in the Pryzak-Niel approach to these things, we have square hysteresis loops called hysterons, and it's a square loop for a uniaxial single domain particle with the field parallel to the particle. Okay. So when you come down from positive saturation, the field switches from one axis to the other at the switching field and goes to negative saturation, and then you bring the field back and it switches to the other axis and goes back to a positive saturation. And remember that we're doing this coordinate transformation. So the reversal field that we're interested in this point is minus 30 millitesla. And the field that we measure at, that we're interested in, is 30 millitesla. And so in this case, BI is equal to minus 30 plus 30 divided by 2, which is 0. Yeah. And BC is 30 plus 30 divided by 2 is 30. So that tells us that what we see on the BC axis is the switching field, the coercivity. Yeah. Simple, but makes sense. Then if you have an interaction field, that the magnetization of that particle is interacting with that of another, the hysteron is biased. In this case, it's moved to the right. And so that's due to an interaction field. So in this case, the reversal field that we're interested in is minus 20 millitesla because it's had this offset. The upswitch occurs at 40 millitesla. We plug those numbers into these equations. BI becomes 10 millitesla, BC becomes 30 millitesla. So BI is then the interaction field that we've applied. And still, BC is the switching field. So BC is the coercivity. And for these hysterons with the field applied parallel to the easy axis, BI is equal to the interaction field. Okay, so this is what leads to the interpretation of FORC diagrams in terms of the duality of interaction versus coercivity. So then if you look at the FORC diagram for these two particles, what will happen is that this symmetric loop has 0 interaction field and a switching field of 30, so it plots there. This biased hysteron is offset to the right, has a positive interaction field of 10 millitesla and a switching field of 30. Okay, so that's the simple interpretation for uniaxial single domain particles approximated by hysterons. So Carl Fabian produced this diagram many years ago, which I think represents the up switch, the down switch and the up switch very well. And so along the central ridge axis, you have symmetrical hysteresis loops with no coercivity and increasing coercivity. In the upper FORC half plane, you have positively biased loops, and in the lower half plane, you have negatively biased loops. And so in this world, the coercivity remains the same, but you have spreading in that way. Is it that simple? No. Right? Real single domain particles are not hysterons. Uniaxial single domain particles behave like Stoner-Wolfart particles. And so that means that in a randomly oriented assemblage, the field is not along the easy axis all the time. So what Stoner and Wolfart showed was, yep, you get a hysteron when you're parallel to the field, and you get no coercivity when you're perpendicular to the field. And so for a randomly oriented set of uniaxial single domain particles with respect to the field, MR over MS is equal to 0.5. That's where that comes from. Yeah. And so Adrian Muxworthy and others published this nice paper where they showed what you would get for Stoner-Wolfart particles rather than these simple hysterons. And this is what a set of FORCs looks like for that. And you do get the peak at 0 and 30 still, but you get this boomerang feature. And if you want to read the details, you can, but the boomerang feature is because of the curvature in this part of the upswitch, and you get this negative region, which is due to the curvature in this part of the downswitch. Yeah, and this negative region is a fundamental response of uniaxial single domain particles and should always be there. Okay, so classical Prysak-Nail theory gives us a basis for interpreting FORC diagrams. It's been tested, and you know, going back to the whole debate about Prysak versus FORCs, well, you know, the last 25 years, our whole community spent a lot of effort trying to put empirical, practical, theoretical clothes around what these responses mean, because Prysak-Nail doesn't really fit. But that is what it is, yeah. And so it's been done by measuring well-characterized samples. So in the early years, we were trying to find perfectly non-interacting single domain samples to illustrate, and all the other things. And then by modeling and particularly micromagnetic modeling, which is starting to become much more routine. Okay, so they provide a framework for interpreting single domain systems, plus or minus interactions, particles, viscous particles near the SPSD boundary, single multi-vortex states, some prefer to call them PSD, I don't, and multi-domain particle systems. And so micromagnetically, you know, we go from single domain, which we all understand, to flower states, to a single vortex, to more complicated multi-vortex and multi-domain systems. So the question is, what do FORC diagrams look like for those types of particle systems? So let me walk you through each type of behavior. There's a huge literature underneath the hood for each of these, and they're pointed out in my review paper and Ramon's more up-to-date paper. But this is a Kiva Canyon tuff sample from Horst Blom back in the day, with beautifully non-interacting single domain behavior as you expect with a distribution of coercivities that reflects the particle size distribution. And particle size distributions are fundamental to what we measure in earth science. So you can't easily escape from that. And so when you give a particle size distribution of anisotropies essentially to a Stoner-Wohlfahrt model, you'll get something that looks like that. In natural samples, we see a lot of single domain behavior, actually. And these are sediments with a central ridge, much like these. This is a micromagnetic model, an early one from Claire Carvalho and others, where she saw this boomerang feature. In the early years, you'll notice that we didn't show the negative region because we weren't, actually, Chris was aware of it and showed it, but preferred not to plot it. It is the truth of it. But you'll see that these early plots didn't have it, and now we show our FORC diagrams far enough to show this 45 away that gives the negative region. Okay, so in sediments, we see the central ridge a lot. And what we now know, at the time, I probably measured the first, well, I didn't measure it, Chris measured it, the first magnetotactic bacteria sample. And we put it on the shelf because we didn't understand it. We thought they ought to be interacting because of the arrangement, the chain arrangement. But you know, by electron holography, we know that flux linking of the particles makes the chain behave as a large uniaxial single domain system. And that's why we get the central ridge response, even though the individual particles are interacting rather strongly. So we can see that single domain behavior is really common in the geological record because we can untangle it from the broader response that you see in mixed systems. What about interacting behavior? Well, if you think of classical systems that have interactions, then floppy disks are one of those. These are floppy disks, maghemite. Floppy disks are made of maghemite. Maghemite was the most important functional material in the world in the 1980s. And material scientists fabricated with exactly the right aspect ratio to get fantastic recording, tightly packed. And so this is maghemite. And actually, most maghemite has much lower coercivity, but because it's so elongated, you get these high coercivities with strong interactions and negative region uniaxial particles. In natural materials, these are FORC diagrams. I think I probably measured those. Due to greigite, which grows in these framboidal and non-framboidal aggregates where the particles are effectively touching each other. So you get these strong interactions, but this loop closes in on a central coercivity that suggests single domain behavior. And sedimentary orthogenic pyrrhotite, where the pyrrhotite plates interlock and grow into each other, also interact quite strongly. So those are examples of interacting single domain behavior. So let's move a bit finer to the superparamagnetic single domain boundary. This surprised us at first. If you have superparamagnetic particles that are really fine, the magnetization is completely reversible. That means there's no hysteresis, and you take the second derivative, you get 0. But when those particles get close to the SD threshold size, viscous behavior is observed. And so if you have a single domain particle without thermal relaxation, at the reversal point, you don't get any sagging. But when you get thermal relaxation going on, you get a bit of sagging at the beginning of the reversal curve, and that shows up on the FORC diagram. And in this paper in 2001, Chris showed 4 manifestations of thermal activation in FORC diagrams. They've all been validated by other measurements. Some people have said, oh, we don't see them, but there's reasons for that. And basically, because FORC measurements are made so rapidly, you're able to detect these small sags in these reversal curves that give measurable responses that tell you about viscous particles. And viscosity is a feature of paleomagnetism that we're dealing with all the time, right? So the fact that we see it commonly in FORC diagrams simply tells you, well, that's why you've got an overprint going on. Okay, so if we look at particles near the SPST boundary, this is another force form sample from back in the day. He measured a frequency dependence of susceptibility of 30. The fork distribution is centered on the origin. This what we call a secondary peak, and then these nearly vertical contours in the lower half plane are another characteristic feature. There are others like the upward shift, which people don't talk about so much, but Tom Berndt has recently done some really nice work on that. And then if you put it into a thermal activation model, you can replicate these behaviors. Okay, so of course superparamagnetism can be detected by measuring variations over time, temperature, and frequency. Yeah, and frequency is harder to do with these magnetometers, but time and temperature are straightforward to do. And so these things are all detectable and quantifiable. There's a lot more behind that we could talk about, but time is limited today. Okay, then if we jump from SP to SD to multi-domain behavior, I call these types of fork diagrams, which we see for geological multi-domain samples, fine multi-domain behavior, because really coarse stuff behaves rather differently. But these types of fork diagrams have divergent contours. They're not focused around the horizontal central ridge anymore. They diverge towards the vertical axis. And if you look at really coarse material, transformer steel is an example. I don't know how long it took Chris to measure these, because in multi-domain systems, there's almost no hysteresis. And so he measured, remeasured, and he was a perfectionist. And it took him weeks for each of these fork diagrams. So please respect that. So with transformer steel, there's, look at the coercivities, minuscule. Yeah. And so for really coarse stuff, with lacking domain wall pinning or with weak domain wall pinning, you get these vertical contours. So totally different to the representation for single domain particles. And then if you've got a bit of stress in this magnetite before annealing, you get something that looks like this with actually quite high coercivities in places. Okay, so these coarse MD samples have dominantly vertical fork distributions, and they grade from vertical to divergent. And most of the time in geological materials, we're seeing something that approximates that. Okay. Then we get to the style of behavior that's intermediate between single domain and multi-domain. And at the last Santa Fe meeting or the Santa Fe Utrecht, was that the last? Was there one in between? I can't remember. Anyway, sorry, I caused a little bit of debate, let's put it. So if you have single domain behavior here and multi-domain behavior here, what happens in between that? And so the early measurements of fork diagrams, when they were first, starting to be intensively studied in relation to geological applications. These are David Dunlop's famous 4 samples. The coarse hydrothermal sample has what we've just talked about, very low coercivities, vertical fork distributions. And as you go finer, you get this increasing divergence as we've just talked about, okay? But these are all very coarse. What happens between this, which is probably, I don't know, 100 nanometers, and this, which is 7 microns? And Chris, back in the day, if you look at this volume of Journal of Applied Physics, there was Pike et al., pages whatever, and then the next paper was Pike and Fernandez. And at the time, I didn't understand what vortices were. I thought this is really exotic. Most of us thought that way, I think. And he was getting weird fork diagrams like this, where these represent the vortex nucleation annihilation fields. And if they differ slightly, then you get this butterfly feature. Some people call this the butterfly, but this is the butterfly. And so if you go back to simple terms and think about the hysteron representation giving a point here, if you have a Stoner-Wolfart distribution, then you have a peak here and a positive going that way down to the negative. But then if you split this up and say, okay, these are vortex nucleation annihilation events. So you go from positive saturation, you nucleate a vortex, you get these features here. You go along, you annihilate it, go to negative saturation, then nucleate the vortex again, annihilate it, it goes away. You get peaks in your fork diagram in these places, which explains these types of fork distributions. And then if you diminish the openness of that loop, then these values push towards the origin, yeah? And if these open bits are larger, they go further away. So applying the same simplistic hysteron type understanding to vortex nucleation annihilation, that can explain these styles of fork diagrams. And you'll say, well, in geological samples, we don't see that, do we? And so if you look at material science papers, they control their grain size and spacing of particles far more nicely than in nature. And so if you look at these iron nanodots, which have different sizes, at 52 nanometers, you have this lovely uniaxial single domain fork diagram that we're used to seeing. But at some point between 52 and 58, you nucleate single vortex style with this butterfly feature out here. And as you grow to 67, it really becomes clear that this single vortex behavior is dominating in those systems. So the question is, well, what are we seeing in geological materials? And this is where there's a logical leap in my presentation, and I can talk to anyone. I don't know if Ramon's going to talk about T-forks, I-forks, etc. Probably not.
Yeah, in the talk on Wednesday.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. So the thing about fork diagrams is that when you measure something in field, what we measure paleomagnetically is out of field, right? It's a remnants. And when you measure in field, you're applying strong fields. So for example, if you're doing Tellier experiments, you should, according to theory, we now know single vortex particles behave wonderfully well over geological timescales, yeah? But if we're applying ourselves to Tellier experiments, we want non-interacting single domain particles. And what we found is that forks should be really good at telling you if your sample has the right type of particles or not, right? And when you go and measure them, you'll find that you get beautiful Tellier behavior for stuff that's on a fork multi-domain. Very perplexing. And the reason for it is what's carrying the remnants is not what's dominating your magnetization inside the field. That's a bit of a problem. And so you can untangle all of that with a new range of fork diagrams, which split out the remnant, the induced, and the transient magnetizations. It's incredibly powerful with a new set of fork diagrams. And I could walk you through how you measure them and what they mean, but time is against us for that purpose today. They were developed by a long-term member of our group, Sheng Zhao. And I'm simply going to show you the results and encourage you to think about using these types of measurements because they're very powerful. Okay, so again, like we've done since the beginning of our journey, we've gone for samples that can be well characterized rather than the really nasty, dirty stuff that we deal with every day. So these are bacterially produced hexagonal plates. You can see there's one in cross-section that's a plate. And they're approximately hexagonal magnetites produced by a thermophilic iron-reducing bacterium. And you can see the particle sizes indicated. They're hundreds of nanometers, so they're not single domain. They're in the single vortex state. Well, these results would suggest that. So the fork diagram looks like this, where you have these lobes in the upper and lower half plane that reflect those distributions of vortex nucleation annihilation fields that I just talked about. And so what we're able to measure is a type of fork diagram called a transient fork diagram. It borrows on language developed by Carl Fabian and Yongjae Yu and Lisa Tokes. And we can split that out. And so you get these lobes in the T-fork diagram that are much cleaner than these things. And you can see the vortex nucleation annihilation field distribution quite clearly in that. And we also have an induced fork from the induced magnetization. And it takes some explaining. But what you see in the induced fork is that typical of single vortex states is this negative, positive distribution. And so we're able to see in fork diagrams what's going on as you move into this single vortex range. Okay, so then if we show you, this is I think it's an andesite, so very typical fork diagram that you get in a lot of types of materials. Diverging contours, something that's closed at lower coercivities with this elbow out here. Johan and Rich call these pirate hat distributions, and they've published on this. You see in the T-fork, in the lower half plane, there's a bit of thermal activation that's causing that to drift away, but in the upper half plane, you can see very clearly that it's closing around that vortex lobe, and you get the negative, positive induced fork signal. Okay, so those are very typical examples of vortex state behavior that you can pull out when you look at natural samples that have a distribution of particle sizes that can otherwise be quite confusing. You can start to see the individual components. And I forgot to include a diagram where a sediment where we have SPSD, non-interacting single domain, vortex state behavior that we can pick out with these types of diagrams all in one sample. So I would argue that this type of diagram, and there's a link to the software that Dario's put up on the site for measuring and processing these types of diagrams. They take twice as long to measure as a normal fork diagram, but the extra diagnostic power I think is tremendous. Okay, and then Johan can talk at length about this, but I find their paper in JGR really wonderful. It takes some digesting because it's complicated. But if you go from positive saturation and you follow C, D, E, F, go back to G, and then come back to H, blah, blah, blah. Each of those points on the hysteresis loop are represented by a micromagnetic simulation. And you can see the vortex core moving around with the applied field in different parts of this representation. And this is what the particle looks like. So they've imaged it nanoscopically, meshed it with a finite element grid, and then using Merrill calculated these micromagnetic simulations. And what you get is vortices nucleating, annihilating, just like what I've shown you on other curves, and giving rise to these data points. And some important distributions are on the central ridge as well for these systems. So that's a single vortex, yeah? So that's what we're used to seeing in what I've shown you so far. If you get much more complicated materials, and I'm not convinced that this is particularly representative of what you see in nature, but it's a multi-vortex complicated particle. You can see these green vortex cores all over the particle. It's complicated. And you see these up and down switching events and a fairly messy looking fork diagram. And then when you show in black contours the fork diagram for the original bulk material, and then start to populate the fork space with responses from the various simulations, you're getting close. It's hard with micromagnetics to get forks in detail, but you're starting to fill in the space. So they would argue that these pirate hat, these 1, 2, 3 lobe distributions are due to multi-vortex states, which I think are fairly common in nature. Is that a fair representation, Johan? He can talk about it much better than me. So if you want to know the details, he can explain it really well. Okay. Time has flown. There are other recent developments that I'd love to talk to you about, but can't. There are some interesting things. So can forks help us to determine magnetic mineralogy? And I'd say, no, it's too dangerous to do that straight from a fork diagram. But actually, most of the time you can say, oh, well, that's probably magnetite. Oh, that's probably hematite. And probably greigite and probably pyrrhotite. But I would say, no, you have to identify them separately. But your forks can be very helpful for giving you an indication. Recent work by Johan and Richard Harrison and others has shown that we can also detect the dominant anisotropy type. So uniaxial single domain behavior, we've talked about a lot, right? You get the central ridge and the negative. So that's classic response for uniaxial single domain. Multi-axial systems are also important in paleomagnetism and in magnetic materials. And they also have a different characteristic response that we can now identify. So that's very important. And those papers will give examples. Harrison and Lascu presented Forculator, which gives you an opportunity to calculate the fork response for single domain particles. And you can change the configuration, the anisotropy, the alignment. It's a really wonderful way of visualizing. And basically, I stood on their shoulders in this one, or we did. And this is a paper about hematite, which you see variations between uniaxial and multi-axial or hexagonal anisotropy. And the fork diagrams pick that up very well. So those are interesting recent developments. I was going to give you a test, but I don't think I need to. You'll all get it. Okay, so I think I'll stop and open up for questions. Very basic, right? But I hope you followed the logic. And if you're a beginner, I hope it makes sense. Thanks. And miraculously, I stayed on time.
Well, why is it called a vortex? Like a vortex, I think of something revolving around a single axis.
That's exactly right. Let me show you. Yeah, so the question is, why do we call it a vortex? Sorry, I don't know you. Your name is?
Sorry, Don Fahey, quantum catalyzer.
Yeah, Dan Fahey.
Totally new to this.
Yeah. No, so that's a really good question. So thanks for asking. I want to go back to this one. Okay, so what happens when you have a nice single domain particles? The magnetization is uniform, and for us, we all love that because that type of magnetization is effectively eternal. So we can measure the earliest parts of Earth history recorded by magnetic particles because that recording is amazing. But what happens as that particle increases in size is that the surface charge on the surface makes it energetically unfavorable. So at some point, you spontaneously nucleate a vortex that instead of having all of these charges on the surface, spontaneously nucleates a vortex and creates, because it's curling around, it minimizes surface charge. So actually that red is the vortex core, like where my thumb is, and the magnetic moments are spiraling around that, exactly as you'd expect. So sorry, I'm using lingo that I think our community largely gets, so sorry about that. Okay. Maxwell Brown.
Hi, so it's just a follow-up. So with this description, how does that vary from Stacey and Banerjee's description of a pseudo-single domain?
So the question that Max has asked is, how does this description differ from Stacey and Banerjee pseudo-single domain description? So I'm going to give you my view, which might not be popular amongst some, but Stacey was at the same institution as me. It's a bit of interesting history, actually. Ted Irving, who is a legend of our field, set up the lab at ANU. So we currently run one of the world's oldest labs, along with the Fort Hofdijk lab. Not many of that vintage still exist. But Ted was concerned with the big picture of plate tectonics. And Frank Stacey was hired to bring an understanding of the the rock magnetism, the recording of those magnetic signals into the university. So very interesting. And I reckon historically, so Minnesota is very interesting in this regard too, because Brown, the father of micromagnetism, was here in the electrical engineering department, and they've continued a really proud tradition here at University of Minnesota in that department of micromagnetism. And at about that time, the thinking in rock magnetism diverged from that in material science, where the material scientists were starting to calculate things micromagnetically and saying, okay, the transition from single domain is a single vortex. And we were seeing this gradual drop when you got too coarse to be single domain anymore, this gradual drop in remanence and gradual drop in coercivity that didn't drop off sharply as you would expect for multi-domain materials. So, and it's really sizable. That goes from 100 nanometers to many microns in magnetite. And so the term, Frank Stacey coined the term pseudo single domain to explain this, that basically you get the magnetic stability of single domain, but it's not single domain. So it's pseudo single domain. And Lisa Tokes would like to say, well, actually it's more pseudo multi-domain, but that's another point. So my view of that is we diverged away from material science, and I prefer to think of the physics that's controlling the magnetization process, and I think it's dominantly this vortex behavior, which in much of our literature has been considered an exotic state. And so I'd like people to start thinking more about vortices, and I think that's happening slowly. Rather than the odd, weird things with imbalance moments that happen, you know, when your vortex is misaligned in the core and all of that. It's still a vortex. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about it.
We have a question from Win Williams online.
Win.
Hi, Andy. So nice presentation. So
Wait. I just need to turn your volume up. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello.
We can hear.
Okay, great. So you know, I've been thinking about forks, and I'm sure I still don't understand the fine details of the forks. But I just wanted to query a couple of things that you said. First of all, I mean, forks have a tremendous amount of information, and I still think we're kind of at the beginning of really trying to get a consistent story out of that. And part of that, I think, from my point of view, as you might think, I'm slightly biased, is really understanding this PSD of vortex or multi-vortex signature in the fork diagrams. One of the things I'm still confused about, and maybe you can point out where or what your opinion is on this, is that the examples of the fork signatures that you've given are generally in sort of the nanodots, which have a thin disks essentially. They're not really sort of spherical dots, they're thin disks. So have a kind of a high anisotropy in the plane, or sorry, normal to the plane. And those give rise to high switching fields for vortices that then mean that both they're offset and they have a displacement from along the BC axis. So they produce the pirate hat, and you can see how they can produce that butterfly that's displaced along the BC axis. But in most systems, and in prolate grains, they'd be hugging they're very small switching fields for vortices, and so you'll have a vortex state that doesn't give a vortex signal in the same way as nanodots do. And then you have single vortex states in prolate grains. So I would suggest that the vortex signatures would be really clear in things like hematite or plate type particles, so strongly oblate grains. And yet in prolate grains, the vortex systems would look almost single domain like, except actually in elongate uniaxial vortex systems, you wouldn't get that negative peak that you see in single domain theory. So it's still practically, I think it's still kind of difficult to interpret the main states and mineralogy. And I'm wondering if you had an opinion about discriminating between these different domain states and different shaped particles.
Yeah. Thanks, Wynne. Could people hear that? Very difficult. Okay. So I think everyone online can hear it, so that's all right. But Wynne's basic question boiled down, forgive me if I oversimplified, Wynne, is that he's wondering, he thinks we're at the beginning of understanding vortex state systems and forks, and that they're complicated, and there are all sorts of other particle types that have complex signals, and I'm going to struggle to summarize it more than that. But when I would simply say I agree with you. I think first you have to recognize that vortices are important before you decide to study them. And so I think we're at the beginning of that journey. I think Johan's work, it very nicely starts it. I agree that it's complicated. I think we need lots of micromagnetism to back it up, and you guys are at the forefront of that. And if you're throwing up difficulties in the understanding, I think that's most welcome, because we need to get our heads around that. You know, but there will be systems that have vortices and systems that don't. So I wouldn't expect hematite, for example, to have them. You know, but soft ferrimagnets, yes. Yeah. So
Andrew, I was going to show you a little example, but I don't know if it's practical to share my screen. Is it?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, let's see.
Do I need to allow that? I need to stop.
Share.
And then
He should be able to.
can you just share straight away?
Yeah, sorry, I had this all. Didn't think you were going to say yes. So I had this.
Sorry when I'm messing you up. You go. Of course we'll say yes.
Okay, so I got a very messy screen. I'm not sure what happened to this. Well, anyway, let me try this. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so what we have here is this is something that Greg Patterson, Les Nagy, myself, Adrian Muxworth have been working on. And I think you might have seen early versions of this, Andrew. I don't remember. But looking at simulated fork diagrams for distributions of grains. And let's see, if I put this firmly up into the single vortex grain size range for prolate grains. So this is something which will be online in the next few months. The signal, once it's calculated, you will see looks pretty much like a classical single domain signal, right? There's not too much. I mean, I suppose here you could say there's some evidence of uniaxial, but there's no vortex signal at all, except in the far positive region of BU. And if you look then at really, let's change this to highly oblate grains and make that a bit narrower, maybe. That's so this aspect ratio really, so 0 to 1 are oblates and 1 and above are prolates. Then what you will see all of a sudden in these highly oblate grains is something more of the vortex signature that you've seen, but it's only because you have this very high switching due to in this case an imposed high shape anisotropy. So here you've got your butterfly. Oh, can you see my pointer?
Yep.
So yeah, I guess is your butterfly signature, and here is the high switching field of the vortex states.
Yep.
So vortex, the vortices and prolate grains appear to be, would normally, I think, be kind of mixed up in an interaction signal, or is there are there other distinctive factors of interactions that would distinguish it?
So for me, the whole interaction thing, I think over time, we've always said that for PSD and multi-domain, that the vertical spread is not due to interactions in the classical sense. But
Okay.
I think the whole dualism of interactions coercivity has become so entrenched that people just interpret it that way. So in multi-domain systems, I would say vertical spread is due to domain wall nucleation annihilation, and in vortices to vortex nucleation annihilation dominantly. But those particles are probably interacting too. So, you know, I don't think we're on top of all of that, which is where simulations are very important. Nick Swanson Heisel wants to say something.
Well, I'm just curious about, I mean, connecting to the data you showed from Nono's paper. I'm thinking about this point that Lynn's right now, which is trying to bridge that gap, like where they're like the grains we did see that showed those formation and annihilation with the sort of classic spread, were those open late and thus giving that behavior.
Yeah, so
So I'm going to hand the microphone around so people online can listen.
Thank you. The grades that we stumbled upon were sort of equidimensional but irregular, maybe a little oblate. But I wanted to point out that Valdez, Grijalva, and Adrian and Nguyen actually simulated forks on vortices of Bregheit on cuboctahedra, so very regular shapes, and those show exactly the features we found with the nucleation, annihilation, and central vision. So yeah, we're at the beginning. We're exploring all sorts of minerals and particle sizes and shapes and aspect ratios, and we can get there.
Yeah, it was difficult to hear, but I think, I mean, necessarily what this shows is a high switching field for vortices. So there must be some mechanism by which that's enabled, really. The other thing, of course, in many other fork simulations to date, they've been along specific field directions. So all these are for random distributions of grains. And so I think that's an important thing when evaluating simulations, certainly to make sure that you integrate it over the sphere properly. But I mean, the data's in there. It's just a matter of trying to decipher everything from these fork diagrams, and the transient forks, I think, are a good way forward, but again, require a whole new level of understanding and interpretation. Anyway, I don't mean to take over the session, Andrew. I just wanted to point these out and
So when all good points, and I love your software and look forward to seeing that released. Really powerful and useful. But I think we agree that we're at the beginning of that particular journey. I see Ramon itching and would love to hear his opinion, but there's a question.
So you show either.
Wait.
Hi, thank you very much, Jonathan Stein, postdoc IRM. So I don't know what screen are we currently showing Andrew's can you show like one of those final slides with the multi-vortex? Yeah, that one. Okay. So when I was first starting with forks, long story short, I had a very noisy sample. But when I combined that with still learning about them, I was still an early graduate student learning about the basics of rock magnetism and other tests that I had that implied pseudo single domain like day plots, etc. And then when I would do research and I'd find articles like this where they would print out model fork diagrams that looked very similar to noise along with kind of the crossing fork lines. So I guess my question is for both in order to prevent that confusion between, oh, is this a multi-vortex or is this background noise, which in my case was background noise. How do we clarify that for both early researchers as well as potentially say, like a soil scientist who just wants to dabble in rock magnetism to prove their point, so you can prevent that confusion.
Thanks for the question. I think Ramon's going to talk this afternoon about pitfalls and measurements, and there are many. And I mean, you know, the number of bad hysteresis loops I see when I review papers where they don't close and all of that. And when I see that, I go back and remeasure the hysteresis loop and remeasure. And sometimes you don't get a good hysteresis loop, in which case I don't publish those results. And fork diagrams are even worse, right? They can be so hard to measure that you're best leaving that sample alone and finding something you can measure, or repeat measuring and stacking, or using other techniques. We use an irregular grid measurement protocol at times, which is helpful for weaker samples. Ramon's got a view on all of this, which I think having a one-to-one conversation would be really helpful. But the point I would make in response to the question around rock magnetists versus dabblers, let's say, I think for all of us, there's sufficient complexity in what we're dealing with on a daily basis that becoming expert is really helpful. And I realized that the entry barrier for forks is getting harder because there's so many algorithms, there's so many processing steps, all of that. So I'm hoping today helps with that a fair bit. I think there's a couple of nice review papers out there that help step people through it. But the measurement complexities are genuine and should not be glossed over. I totally agree. And when you get forks crossing each other, that's usually a sign that your measurement, yeah, you know. So I don't know if there's the Lakeshore guys are here, right? I saw Cosmin. So probably as a community, there's comments that we would make to instrument manufacturers. Speed is great, but the most important thing is precision. Really critical to making these measurements, and that's a hard thing to do. And for us, we're dealing with all sorts of materials that some are really got almost nothing in them. So yeah, it's a challenge. Josh.
Could I ask you a favor? Could you go back into Zoom and then bring up the fine multi-domain?
And I didn't share the screen, so sorry.
Yeah.
Where did Zoom go even?
It's there.
Right. So with that fine multi-domain behavior that you're sharing, is that sort of triangular distribution that you're getting, or it's broadening as you go lower and lower cities? Is that, in your interpretation, would you view that as just a distribution of vortices annihilating themselves and nucleating, or would you view it as an interaction of vortices within walls? What is giving rise to that sort of that triangular state?
Thank you. So I would say, and I'm glad Wynn is asking these questions, because I'd say that we need a really rigorous micromagnetic underpinning of all of this. And one of the criticisms of forks from the early years was, oh, it's very qualitative, not quantitative. And if we want to make the step from qualitative to quantitative, we need that level of underpinning, I would argue. You could be right. So what I've said for a long time is we do magnetic remote sensing, and we don't really know because we're not imaging them. And when people image them and then micromagnetically simulate them by wrapping a mesh around the particles, I think that's an incredibly powerful technique that more and more of that such work needs to be done to try and, you know, and computational power is increasing all the time. So personally, I think that level of work is needed to underpin interpretation, and I don't want to hold my hand on my heart and swear it's this or that. I'm too agnostic for that. Behind Maxwell, but I'm going to give you the microphone.
No, it's fine. So it's a related question, and this is Don again from Cal. Typically, these are beautiful diagrams. If you have 100 of them for 100 different samples, all related, and you wanted to study them, what techniques are typically used for extracting quantifiable measures to then compare them across a large set? So Fourier transforms or
I think if somebody else answers the question, I'd probably answer it differently. But what I'm showing you with these diagrams are reproducible over hundreds, thousands of samples. We see these patterns of behavior all the time. But because we're remote sensing from bulk measurements, understanding the underlying micromagnetism is a challenge. So to break from that to where we need to go, I'd say simulations and nanoscale observations are needed. But basically, as a community, we do a huge amount of magnetic measurements that remote sense what we're dealing with. And that it's much more complex than for material science, right? Because material science, you image your material, you know what it is, you fabricate it a certain way. It's not that complicated. But whereas we're dealing with geological materials that form in magma chambers or sediments that and variable stress, all sorts of variations in cation content of the material that causes all sorts of variations. So we're dealing with complexity.
Thanks, Andy. So in the last part of your talk, you were breaking down the Vork diagram, looking at different aspects of the T-fork, the REM-fork, the I-fork. And one of the main questions here was to isolate what might be a remnants carrier. In the latter diagrams you showed, there was no REM-fork diagram.
Good man. That's because I was trying to make a different point, but you're absolutely right. If I was doing Tellier experiments, I would want to be seeing the REM-fork diagram because that tells you about the remnants carriers. You've split away. So, you know, at school, we learn that the magnetization is the sum of the remnant and the induced, right? So you strip away the induced, you can visualize the remnant. And so what I would expect for these sorts of materials that in forks behave bulk as multi-domain, but they're carrying a beautiful paleointensity signal, I would expect the REM fork to show a nice single domain representation. And so Claire Carvalho published a paper when she was postdocing with me in 2006, where we did this with conventional fork diagrams. And it was confusing because you got multi-domain forks for materials that gave beautiful paleointensities. And so I reckon using that measurement protocol and splitting them out and looking at REM forks would, I'm an optimist about that. So I reckon that would work. But
If you go back to the example with your andesite there,
yeah,
if you could pull it up,
okay, I'll try.
a bit further down. Yeah, that one. Is that the andesite one?
That is the andesite, yeah.
So if you were to have your REM fork here, it's the part in the first diagram that you're not seeing in the other diagram, in the induced fork. So that would be the more single domain.
Repeat your question and I'll pick it up.
So if we're looking for the remnants part in this one, we have the induced part there, so it's going to be somewhat the difference of the first fork diagram and the last fork diagram there. Is that correct, Andy?
I'll show it to you, it's simpler. Maybe I won't. A mistake. Here it is. So lower right-hand side is the REM fork diagram. And so what that would indicate is the REM fork's interesting because you see this thermal activated signal in the lower half plane, almost always. And we see viscosity in almost every geological material. Some people think that's bizarre, but I think it's what you should expect. And so this is the remnants region of the FORC diagram. So you're seeing something. You're seeing this pirate hat-like distribution, so you probably would interpret that as multi-vortex. But you know, we're at the beginning of this, and we need more simulation to underpin it.
But what you're certainly not seeing there is the signal of a multi-domain remnants carrier. You're not having the 45 degrees divergence.
In that case, you'd have a very low remnant.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, this may be a convenient time to slow down the conversation for a little bit. I think right now we have a scheduled coffee break for a half an hour. So everybody can get up, stretch a little bit, talk to one another, interact in a non-magnetic way. And then we'll see you all back here in just a little bit for Ramon Egley's talk on optimizing and processing Vortex.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Josh, if I kill